Welcome to the Write Good Books podcast, the audio companion to WriteGoodBooks.com, with your host Jason Bougger.
Welcome back to the podcast. I'm Jason, and here with our co-host Scott Michael Childers, and we are live. How are you?
I'm fine.
We're not
Jason.
live.
I'm confused
You're
now.
confused,
Jason.
with the live studio audience sighs and groans. Oh my! No, we last time kind of joked about pacing, and it got us thinking, hey, let's do one about pacing. And this is something I see a lot. I read way too many short stories, I feel like, with my Theme of Absence e-zine, and then I've been a judge on a writing contest for another site, thewritepractice.com, which is a great site. There's their shout out. And one of the bigger problems I see in some of these short stories is the pacing. I saw a lot of short stories that will be short, like 1,500 words or so, where the first half might be pure description or pure setting and nothing happens, and then halfway through the story starts, and then I wrote as a comment, sorry, your pacing is off. And it's a big problem because you'll lose your writer right away. And you know, when I was a judge or as the submissions editor at Theme of Absence, they lose me right away. And you know, agents, publishers, everybody, you got to start the story where the story starts. Now, we're not really talking about beginnings, we're talking about pacings, but that was just my quick observation there. So,
Well, and one thing, let me just throw this in here with beginnings, is it sets the expectation for the rest of the piece, whether it's flash fiction, whether it's epic fantasy. You know, the pacing of your first, of your beginning is going to set the expectation of what's this book going to be like. You know, literary fiction sometimes has a more deliberative, slower pace in its reading. Not always, but sometimes. And so that is the tone and pacing that you expect throughout the rest of the book, generally.
Yeah, you need it to be consistent throughout the book, and that first, when you see the pacing of the opening paragraphs, you get a good sense of whether or not this book is for you. Yeah,
along with tone and other things we'll talk about later. Now, that's not saying that that's the pacing that has to be in the rest of the book, because you could change your pacing in other places for great effect. However, the pace, like you were saying earlier, Jason, you're reading and it's just like, I want action. It's a short story. You don't have a lot of time. And you're spending all this time talking about everything but the action, about the conflict, about the plot. There's pacing issues with that.
Yeah. It's interesting. I'm complaining about when something's too slowly paced, but you can also have the opposite as well. If something's too fast and you might want it to slow down and catch your breath.
Oh, yes. So, horror books have to have pacing.
Downs.
And in that case, it's between scenes.
Yeah.
Oftentimes. No, again, we're not talking in absolutes here. But yeah, you need that time for things to really sink in, for you to catch a breath, and that can be done by pacing. And so we've talked about it. How do we provide clues to pacing in our writing?
That's the question, isn't it?
All right. The easiest part, the easiest one, and I think something that a lot of people think of, is chapter breaks. Where do you put your chapter breaks?
Sure, or even your scene breaks.
Or scene breaks within a chapter. You know, where are you putting those? Are you putting them in a spot where you want the pacing to change, where you want a pause, a breath, a reflection of what has happened?
I guess with me, you build to the climax of the scene or the resolution of the chapter, and then you take a break and slow things down.
Well, it kind of depends. I mean, in some books, I think epic fantasy or epic tales of any sort, sometimes you want a nice clean break at chapter, so that way the reader knows it's safe to put the book down now.
Yeah.
In shorter books, you want a cliffhanger there because you want them to keep turning the page.
Oh, sure.
But there's still it's like the pacing changes at that time. Whether it's a stop because of surprise, stop because of a revelation, or things just like, okay, we're going 0 to 60 with this last line before we hit the chapter break.
Yeah.
But those are signposts for readers that know a chapter break means a change happens, usually in scene.
And then you can also control the pacing with the language.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah, when you have a slower scene, you might use some adjectives. Sometimes I hate adjectives. That's when you'll use more descriptive writing, and you'll give the characters a chance to look around and take in the setting and kind of give the reader more feel of what's going on. And then when the action hits, you'll want shorter sentences and more direct. I mean, you may even switch into a little more telling style of writing. He punched, he kicked, he ran.
Yeah.
And, speed it up. And
absolutely. We kind of talked about this with the dialogue thing we did a while ago. The choice of words, the choice of syntax does change the pacing of a paragraph. I could sit here and tell you a long, drawn-out, not well thought out, run-on sentence that goes on forever and really doesn't have a meaning. It slows down the pace. Or I could say, I don't know what I'm going to talk about. Quick.
Pause.
Yeah, but if I had a lot of short, quick sentences with short little words, and I'm overemphasizing here, but it changes the pace of how fast people get through that section. And so they're breezing through things. Action, like you were saying, Jason, it's your choice of words, your choice of syntax can make all the difference in the pacing of a tale. So let me ask you this. In a piece where that first paragraph was a lot of setting, if they would have even described the setting with less detail, left out some of the detail and got into more of the story faster, you'd have to generalize here, but do you think that would have solved the pacing problem?
I think I looked at it as percent. If the first half is a description of a setting, I don't know if you can fix that. But
so they might have had to chop out a good chunk.
Yeah. So even trying to speed that up a bit, I don't think would work. You need to know what the story's about sooner than where it takes place or whatever. It's complicated. That's what my 5-year-old says whenever I ask him a question he doesn't want to answer or doesn't know how. He just says, it's complicated. Where did that cake go? It's complicated.
My gosh, he's learning young.
He is. There's no pacing there. That's just went from 0 to adulthood overnight. But, I think the pacing is, I think your genre can in some ways be determined by your pacing. A young adult fantasy is going to have quicker language, less descriptive sentences, and that's part of what makes it a young adult story. At least the style it's written in.
Yeah, I suppose it could.
Like you said about horror, you'll have a slow build, and then you'll have your big gotcha, and then you'll slow it back down. Epic fantasy, I haven't read a lot of epic fantasy, but you've got a lot more slower world building parts.
Yeah. And I'd say you have a lot more roller coaster in your pacing. You're going to have epic. You're going to want something to really sink your imagination into as you're reading. So you're going to have slower sections as they world build.
Yeah.
But then you're going to have, and then the dragon came.
Yeah, you'll have a really slow build up to a powerful moment.
Yeah, in many cases. So.
Where with a thriller, you might have the quiet before the storm, and then the storm hits, and there's not a lot of build in that quiet part.
Yeah, and in some thrillers, it's bam, 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 bam.
Yeah.
And then, bam.
And then silence. Everybody's dead.
And then epilogue after epilogue after epilogue. So, and part of this is, and we're talking about this thing, some of this you're not going to even think about in your first draft.
Oh, that's true.
In your first draft, you may choose that pacing is not your worry. You're going to worry more about the plot, character development, some other focus in your first draft, or just getting it out there. And then pacing is something that you could work on through your revision cycle, especially after you have the whole piece and you kind of see where are those spots where I'm going to have to get my reader up the roller coaster and then let them drop for that, whatever genre you're writing. So I would say don't worry so much about pacing, especially those nitpicky things that we were talking about with word selection and grammar choices. I'd worry about that in a revision stage.
Yeah.
And you may end up moving a whole scene around because, wow, the scene, especially if you have multiple point of view, you may move those point of views around to get that pacing right. You may say, I'm going to do every other chapter a different point of view character.
Sure.
But it may wreck your pacing in some cases. So you have a couple chapters with the same point of view. Or you have one chapter with 2 points of view with a scene break of some sort.
And that's a good thing to think about, because sometimes I get a little OCD, and if I'm writing multiple point of view, I'm like, well, I can't have this character have the same voice 2 chapters in a row. That would be...
Bob always gets the even number chapters.
Yeah, that's how it is. Bob does not always need to be even number chapters. Very reminder to ourselves, I'll say out loud, we need to do one on point of view.
Oh, okay.
If we haven't already.
Okay, we need to talk about Bob.
Yes, Bob needs to be talked about more. Your voice, your narrative voice, is also defined by your pacing. If you talk real slow, as I do when I try to think about what I'm going to say, that's my narrative voice. And since we were talking about point of view, some characters might be a little more fast-paced than other characters, and that might be how they're written, and you might use one character to slow your story down, and you might have another character to speed things up. Kind of like in the old Nitro days, they'd bring out the luchadors to speed up the match before the dinosaurs came out for the main event.
Wow, there's an inside reference. But yeah, you're right, especially if you're doing first person, then that really could change. Because you've also got to put across a character in those cases. And the pacing of that character's thoughts can reveal, do they think in big, convoluted paragraphs? Do they monologue to themselves?
Right.
Or is it like really simple thoughts that lead to immediate action?
Yeah, how well do they think out their actions? How well do they think out what they're going to say? Or do they just react to everything?
Yeah. And we'll talk more about this when we finally get around to point of view, I imagine. But, reflective versus action, that type of thing. But, I've had some people who will come in and tell me, in my role as librarian, I don't read books, but I read this one.
Oh, what is this one?
It changes to person. But what happened is they've read books that have a pacing that they could not keep up with. It was either too fast or too slow for their tastes.
Yeah.
And then they find a book that has a pacing that matches that taste. It wasn't a genre decision. It was a pacing issue. And so that's another reason why I would encourage you, dear listener, to have your own voice when you write, because you're going to get an audience that likes the pacing of your writing style as opposed to another author's. Even if you're in the same genre or even telling the same story. And that's one of those distinctions between authors, I think, that people don't talk about much, is the pacing of their stories.
I often joke about being scarred from reading from the books we read in high school until I discovered the type of books I like. And, I liked Cujo, and it had nothing to do with the horror story behind it. It was just an easier read for me.
It was a book that moved along at a pace you felt comfortable reading it. And I'll tell you, I have some old patrons of mine, and old being not that they were old, they can't read those books because it moves too fast.
Wow.
They want a more deliberative reading experience. They want a slower paced book, something that leads them through a longer period. I don't know how to say this. It's not
Feels.
it's not plodding. Plodding along slowly, effortfully.
It's more descriptive.
Yeah.
And then on the other end of that, when you see people who say, I don't read, but I read Twilight. I don't read, but I read Harry Potter. It's John Green. It's faster paced. What we would call an easier read isn't necessarily easier. It's just
the pacing
quicker,
is what
yeah.
attracts. And I think we talked about writing for the non-reader.
Yeah.
Well, there's one of the things.
Yeah.
It has a pacing that keeps the pages going. So, depending on your genre, you may not want that, and that's not an audience you want to reach. Fine. You don't feel like you have to write faster than...
Right. You can write space opera for faster paced sci-fi, or you can write hard sci-fi for slower paced, as I stereotype it entirely.
You could write slow paced space opera. Let me tell you, you can, and it's one of those many facets of books. We can't just pigeonhole a book, and we are kind of rambling at this point, I think.
We are, aren't we? So maybe our pacing is a little off, and this would be a good time to close things out. You got any closing thoughts?
Don't write your books as if you're impersonating Christopher Walken.
There you go.
Or William Shatner.
And don't try too hard. Yeah, both great paced speakers. Don't try too hard with the pacing. I think do what's natural and it'll come off as the most authentic. And slow down when you need to, speed up when you need to. And I think that'll do it. So check us next time and visit us on the web at www.writegoodbooks.com/podcast. Thanks.
See ya.